Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. And this evening, we're going to have a really interesting conversation today because I have as my guest Mr. Sam Daley-Harris. And I'm going to mention a couple of things about Sam here from his biography. He's actually the founder of an organization called Results. And we've had Results volunteers on our show several times over the last couple of years. And Sam is also the CEO of an organization called the Center for Citizen Empowerment and Transformation. And we're going to talk a lot about that as we have this discussion today. He's also the author of a fantastic book, which I've had the privilege of reading. It's called Reclaiming Our Democracy, Healing the Break Between People and Government. And so Sam and I have a lot to talk about today. So Sam, welcome to Reference Point. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
So now you're actually in Washington, D.C. area or New York?
Well, I lived in D.C. for 22 years, but now I live in Princeton, New Jersey.
Princeton, New Jersey. Okay, cool. So you're joining us from the other side of the country, and we really appreciate that.
That's right.
Well, I want to talk a lot. We have a limited amount of time, but I want to talk about some of these really interesting things. I'd like to have us understand a little bit more about this organization called Results, which is, I guess, where you really started to get into the area of I don't know if it's political involvement is the right way to state that, and how you came to do that, because it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, great. And I love telling it because it really starts with my hopelessness and then getting into action. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in music.
Oh.
And I played percussion instruments in the Miami Philharmonic Orchestra in Florida for 12 years.
Oh, fantastic.
And then I founded the anti-poverty lobby Results. And a lot of times I'm asked, music, poverty,
how did that connect? Yeah, I can understand. So, I'm a singer. I sing with a chorus and do barbershop singing, so I get the music side of it, but the other side.
So when I look back through my life, there are a couple of experiences that come to mind that would make this shift. I graduated from high school in 1964 and played timpani in the orchestra at the graduation ceremony. And just before the ceremony, a flute player came back to the percussion section and told me that a high school fraternity brother, a year younger, had died the day before in a tractor-trailer accident in Georgia. It was her next door neighbor, so she knew about it before I did. I was 17. When I was 17, I thought I had forever. I mean, mortality was an irrelevant concept.
Right.
But during the mourning period and the funeral, it began to dawn on me that I might have 15 more minutes or 17 more months or years.
Who knows?
And the questions of purpose came up. Why am I here? What am I here to do? 4 years later, 1968, college graduation, Robert Kennedy is assassinated right around that time. And it's another one of those, what is this life? What is this death? Why am I here? What am I here to do? No answers, but the questions are getting clear.
Right.
9 years later, I always say I'm a little slow. I'm invited to a presentation. This is 1977 on ending world hunger. Now I'm still a musician, and I go to this thing thinking, well, hunger's inevitable because there are no solutions, because if there were solutions, somebody
would have done it already.
By now, yeah. And I'm a musician. What do I know? So I go into this thing, and it's quite obvious right away. There's no mystery to growing food or clean water or basic health. I'm not hopeless about the perceived lack of solutions. I'm hopeless about human nature. People will just never get around to doing the things that can be done. But there's one human nature I have some control over, my own.
Of course.
And my questions, why am I here? What am I here to do? So I get involved in a big way, and this is the end of the story. In 1978 and 1979, I spoke to 7,000 high school students.
Wow.
On ending world hunger. And before going into the presentation, I read some statements from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Food and Nutrition Study and others calling for the political will to end hunger.
Right.
So I asked 7,000 high school students, what's the name of your member of Congress? I don't want to know if you wrote him. I don't want to know if you met him. Just the name. And out of 7,000 students, 200. Fewer than 3% could tell me the name of their member of Congress. Just over 97% could not tell me.
Had no idea, right.
And results started out of this gap between the calls for the political will to end hunger on the one hand and the lack of basic information on who represented us in Washington. So that's my kind of convoluted story. And then I was off
on how you
and
got
running.
into this. So how does one define political will?
Well, I think about, there's Mark Reynolds, who is the executive director of Citizens Climate Lobby, says members of Congress don't create political will, they respond to it. And I always think of this quote by Buckminster Fuller, who would say, if you wanted to turn around a huge ocean liner, don't try and push it around from the front. Don't even try and turn the rudder, massive rudder. Find the little trim tab at the back of the rudder and turn that. And if you turn that, then the rudder will turn more easily and the whole ship. And he would say, with the ship of state, don't try and push it around from the front. Don't even try and turn the massive rudder. Find the trim tabs. And for me, the trim tabs are my member of Congress, my member of Congress's staff, the newspaper, my letter to the editor. These are all expressions of political will and really approaching people that are these trim tabs,
right,
and have this ability to shape policy.
So what that tells me is that if you know, and as an individual, if you understand that there are points of interaction where you can have an impact, then those multiple points of impact can ultimately have an effect on turning that large ship, if you would.
Yeah. The problem is most people feel hopeless about even trying.
Right.
And if they don't feel hopeless, they kind of link up with an organization that gives them kindergarten. Click here, sign this petition, you're done. Really baby step things.
Right.
And the trick is finding an organization that really feeds you, that really gets you from kindergarten to second, third, fifth, ninth, 12th grade and beyond as a citizen.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I see it, the parallel that I would make here is that people, I'm in the sales and marketing world, right? That's what I've done for a living. And I've been in musical theater, so I love getting up and talking and stuff like that. But I can't tell you how many people I've known over the years who, if they have to get up and say their name in public, they freak out, okay?
Yeah.
So they've never had that experience. They're fearful of that kind of interaction. They don't know what's going to happen when they do. They think maybe people will laugh at them if they do whatever. And so just transferring that simple area and concept to the area of doing something to move the trim tabs so that you have some impact on this political actuality, they've got to be absolutely terrified because they figure they have first, they have no idea what to do. Second, they're afraid they're going to look stupid. And, so, and third, they have no one to guide them.
Let me give you an idea of a victory so you can get what does this add up to anything? And then let me talk just briefly about the issue you just raised. I don't like to talk in public. I'm kind of terrified. What does this organization or that one do to help me get beyond that? Let me just give you one idea of a victory. We started lobbying in the mid-1980s on child survival issues. UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, reported that 40,000 children around the world were dying every day from largely preventable malnutrition and disease.
Right.
Things like measles coupled with malnutrition. Results lobbied on these child survival interventions and increased funding to the point where the latest report from UNICEF has stated that the 40,000 child deaths a day around the world has gone down to 16,000 a day. And the latest goals from the UN Sustainable Development Summit are to bring it from 16,000 a day to zero by 2030.
Wow.
And so you know, anyone who's been involved with results from the mid 80s was part of this plummeting of child deaths around the world.
That's a
Now, of
huge
course,
number.
oh, yeah. Well, if you go out on the street, the sad thing is, and you say to someone, well, how's the world going? You get an answer, something related to hell in a handbasket.
Right, yeah.
And there's no awareness that any kind of progress is being made anywhere. And so, going back to the methodology, one piece of the methodology are these little things we call laser talks, a little 1-minute talk that we train people to get good at so that you're not as terrified when it's your turn in the congressional meeting or when you're typing a letter to the editor. You actually know what you're talking about.
You know what you're going to say, and you have an understanding. Yeah, that's great. You know, it's interesting. I think when you were mentioning that the general perspective of people when you say, how are things going, it's that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to suggest that part of the sense of that for most people is that virtually the only thing they ever hear about in the media are the bad things that are happening. Nobody who has heard that the deaths of children has plummeted from 40,000 a day to 16,000 a day. Who's heard that? You know, very few people. So the positive things that have been going on are not getting the recognition to the degree that they otherwise could.
Well, let me give you 2 little examples of a hearing about it piece. When Results was lobbying in 1986 on tripling the Child Survival Fund, at that time from $25 to $75 million, it's now $715 million. But the point is, the volunteers and Results that year generated 90 editorials, not letters or op-eds, but where the newspaper itself said, this is important. These kids are dying. It's unnecessary. It's all preventable. We should do this. And I was on a conference call of another group that I've worked with and coached, and that's Citizens Climate Lobby. And I was on their call, their January call. It's on a Saturday. And toward the end of the call, they gave their stats for last year. And they said that last month, the volunteers had 396 letters to the editor published. That would have been in December for that month. And they had 2,900 published in all of 2015. So it's like giving people their voice back.
You know, I want to go into that a little bit right now, because what you were just talking about in terms of this other organization that has had the successes, they emulated some of the, if not all of the primary successful actions that you spearheaded in Results. And in your book, Reclaiming Our Democracy, talks a lot about that. It's really, as you sort of put it in the in one section of the book here, you're kind of giving away the store, so to speak. But what it seems to me that you as an individual are trying to do is to empower those of us that are sitting out here in USA land somewhere, to be able to recognize that on a local, state, national level, you can have an impact if you have a clear vision of what you want to accomplish, if you have a path to follow, and if you've got other like-minded individuals to support you in this effort.
Yeah, the big if is if you can, well, there's one big if is that you're committed, but the other big if is that you get yourself into an organization that has a powerful enough structure of support to carry you through. I was working on one of the newer chapters in the book, and it was outlining the ingredients for this citizen empowerment and transformation. And my wife said what you said, which was, aren't you giving away the store here by listing all these commitments that would bring success? And I said, deep citizen engagement is so misunderstood that even if I knocked it, hammered these lists to every tree in the world,
Right.
People would still screw it up
Yeah.
because it's so
Yes.
misunderstood. And
Yeah.
so, so you really got to get into an organization that feeds you. I mean, just briefly, I'm working with, well, of course, with Results, which is on global and domestic poverty, Citizens Climate Lobby on climate change, with groups like the U.S. Fund for UNICEF on the well-being of children around the world, Friends Committee on National Legislation. They work on peace issues and more. The Peace Alliance, they also work on, obviously, peace issues. These are the kinds of groups that I say feed people the way they deserve to be fed.
I think that's an important distinction because there's a lot of ad hoc groups that come together with a sense of they want to change something, but they don't have a model to follow, and B, like you say, there's no infrastructure to cultivate their interests, their skills, let them know that they have these abilities to be able to do things, and then you end up all they end up with is shouting matches when they go someplace, and that's unfortunate. Sam, I want to ask you something about this Center for Citizen Empowerment and Transformation. Is that directly related to anything tied to your book, or is that a separate organization that uses these principles? Or what? Give me a little data on that.
Well, just very briefly, after a career in music, I founded Results 35 years ago. And then 20 years ago, I co-founded the Microcredit Summit campaign.
Oh, yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit when we get a chance, but go ahead.
4 years ago, I founded the Center for Citizen Empowerment and Transformation. And basically what we do is we train NGOs, we train nonprofits in coaching their members on creating champions in Congress and the media for their cause.
And, you know, we've got about 10 minutes left in our conversation today, and there are two things I really want to talk about in this last 10 minutes. One of them has to do with the microcredit thing that you mentioned, because that was a big eye-opener to me. And secondly, want to kind of look at when you, I'm going to pose a thought or a question, and that is, if you've got two organizations that are understanding what you're presenting to them through the empowerment and transformation activities, but they are on opposite sides of an issue, how does that impact what goes on in Congress? But let's talk about the microcredit first, because that's absolutely phenomenal.
Well, if I could, I always think it's powerful to tell the origin story of an organization.
Sure.
And we were fortunate enough to link with Muhammad Yunus of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh.
Familiar,
in
yes.
1987. He joined our board in 1988 and is still on our board. And the story of how he founded the bank really communicates the potential of this program. He got a PhD in economics at Vanderbilt and eventually went home to Bangladesh to teach economics at a university there. There was a famine in his country, and he said, the economic theories in my textbook are very elegant, but they're not working in the village next to my campus. I'm going to go in the village and learn economics from the villagers. Now, I always used to say it that way. And the way I've said it more recently is people were virtually dying of starvation on the doorstep of his campus. And this young economics professor was having a spiritual crisis. And he said, I'm going into the village to see if I could be of use to one person for one day. That's where he was. This is 1976. He meets a woman who's making bamboo stools for sitting on, and he asks her how much money profit she makes every day. And she says, I make 2 pennies a day profit. He said, how's that possible? It's a beautiful stool. Why do you only make 2 pennies a day profit? She says, well, I don't have the money to buy the bamboo, so I borrow the money from a trader on the condition that I sell the finished product back to him at a price he sets. And the price he sets barely covers the costs of the raw materials, the bamboo.
Right.
I make 2 pennies a day profit. Well, he said, if you could sell it to anyone, could you make more than that? She said, I could, but I don't have the money to buy the bamboo.
Right.
Wait, so he has a student go around the village in 1976, and the student finds 42 people who need a grand total of $27, less than $1 each.
Wow.
I mean, it averages 68 cents per person to pay off the moneylender, buy their raw material, make whatever it is they make. And he lent $27 to 42 people. And this woman went from 2 pennies a day profit to $1.25 a day.
Wow.
Immediately. And this is how these were the first borrowers of what eventually became Grameen Bank, which means village bank or rural bank. And he and Grameen Bank shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006.
Right.
And he's one of 7 people in the world who have won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Congressional Gold Medal, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So it's a really extraordinary story.
It's an amazing piece of information. I've done a little bit of reading about that, and mostly because of my friend and your colleague, Bruce Prevel, who's been on our show before, and he told me about that, and I did some research because my work in the last 10 years has all been involved with providing financial services and access to capital to U.S. businesses who are not able to engage with the banking community. But the scope of things relative to what can be accomplished at that level of what Grameen Bank did in Bangladesh blows my mind. It just is a very exciting thing. And when I was reading about that in your book, it just made me smile. And it's an ongoing activity too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Now, there is a little sad piece to it that for me, there's been a fork in the road, and one fork over time continues to ask, what more can we do for the well-being of our clients?
Right.
But the other fork tends to ask, what more can we do for the well-being of our investors?
Of our investors, right.
And so it becomes much more commercialized
and
much more geared.
I've seen that with a number of groups that went out and tried to do microcredit, and they approached it the way the banking community does in the U.S., and it fails every time. So, but that's an interesting point. Okay, we got a little, maybe 5 minutes left here. I posed that interesting question to you about I think that the principles that you outline in your book make a lot of sense. And granted, if you have an organization that can support that, in the individuals, you can very realistically run into situations where you have people on different sides of an issue that are working in that kind of a thing. But I don't know that that's necessarily a net negative. I think it's probably a net positive.
Yeah, well, so for sure. I mean, I would tend to only work with a group that wants to work for gun safety, or with a group that wants to end global poverty or bring a resolution to climate change, for example.
Sure.
So I wouldn't exactly be working with both. I was on a conference call very recently. It's a citizen climate lobby call, and their guest speaker was Hari Han. All these monthly calls have a different guest speaker, and she's a political science professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she's basically talking about there are 2 different kinds of organizations. A transactional advocacy organization, they really just want you to click here, sign this petition, take this transaction. And then there's the transformational organizations that want to take you in where you are, but help you grow and help you become more established. But she said as she was starting to write her book, she read a book by another professor, and he was studying anti-abortion groups. And he studied women who had stood in front of abortion clinics trying to talk other women out of an abortion, and found that 47% of them, the 100 he spoke to, entered pro-choice or kind of neither one way or another. But it was because they just moved to town and they were looking for something to work with, or a friend invited them and they didn't want to say no, or they were a working mom and now they were a stay-at-home mom and they were looking for an activity. But the point he was making, it was an organization that could bring someone in and then kind of quote unquote graduate them to their will,
their way of thinking.
And so
you know, we've only got another minute or so here, but there's a couple of things I just wanted to say. I wanted to let the audience know that if they have any questions for Sam about this kind of a concept of political empowerment for the average citizen, you can send an email to info@referencepointtv.com. I will forward it on to him, and I think we may have actually put up your, I'm sure we put your email address up there too. So, Sam, we're running out of time here, but I'd like to ask you to summarize, if you can, or some statement to the audience here about what can be accomplished with the right inspiration, or I don't know if that's the right term.
I'm going to just use this quote from Apollo astronaut Rusty Schweickart, who said, "We aren't passengers on spaceship Earth. We're the crew. We aren't residents on this planet. We're citizens." The difference in both cases is responsibility. And if anything of that quote kind of rings true for you, I urge you to find a group like Results or Citizens Climate Lobby or Friends Committee on National Legislation or the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, groups that are offering their volunteers more than a mouse click and more than a transaction.
Fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for joining me here on Reference Point. I greatly appreciate it. It's been fantastic having this conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've learned something here and that you will take the step to get involved, because it's only through the involvement of we as citizens that change can actually take place. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Reference Point.